Welcome back to the third day of the conference. And now we're moving on to the keynote speech by Professor Joel Kirk. Um, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about Joel Kirk. He is a professor of politics at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. He's the author and co-author of 8 books, including Research as More Than Extraction, Knowledge Production and Gender-Based Violence in African Societies, forthcoming with University of Ohio Press. Joel's research focuses on enslavement and abolition, mobility and work, social movements and contentious politics, gender and violence, and the politics and history of Africa. He is the founding editor of Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, where his most recent project was entitled, "It is Time to Get Off the Fence on Sex Worker Rights." So there are also 3 more things that I would like to mention about Joel. So because this conference mainly featured the grantees from the RTA project, Research to Action, and the Human Trafficking Research Initiative project, we actually launched a vote to ask them who they would like to be keynote speakers. So we had Eric on the first day, Kathy Zimmerman on the second day, and now we have Joel Kirk. So we're very honored to have him here. And another thing that I wanted to mention is actually with the ILO, we recently launched host the 5th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor. It was actually in Durban in South Africa. So what a good opportunity to also have a professor from South Africa. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is actually a bit of a personal story. You know how the Research to Action project is making an online course. Actually, I once talked to Joel because he has a course, an online course on ethics that is on forced labor. So with all these good reasons, I would really like to welcome Joel, and I'll pass the mic to you to start the presentation.
First of all, want to thank Lorraine and Lorenzo for this opportunity. I think we can all agree that the topic is an extremely good one, and having participated in the session earlier today, I must confess that I think there's a really excellent collection of people from a range of backgrounds and regions, and I'd really like to commend everyone involved in this for their expertise and experience. So in this presentation, I'm going to step back a little bit from some of the focal points of the conversations which have taken place to date around this question of evidence. And what I really want to do is expand some of my previous research and look at the intersection between evidence and policy, and more specifically between evidence and politics. So I'm interested here in thinking about what happens once research has been conducted and how it gets inserted or not inserted into institutional processes, political deliberations, and most crucially, the kinds of interventions and campaigns and policies which end up being developed in order to address forms of labor exploitation and migrant exploitation and the like. So as a point of departure, and I started off with this in the abstract, I want to think about the connection between evidence, politics, and policy. So as a point of departure for this, I just want to briefly think about the relationship between these 3 factors in relation to the COVID pandemic. COVID was new. It was extremely consequential, as we already all know. And this was one of those occasions where evidence was obviously extremely valuable and significant. And we see that the global scientific community comes together, researching how COVID transfers, researching vaccines, and this in lots of ways demonstrates the value and importance and consequence of scientific research and the things that people in white lab coats do when it comes to kind of public health and interventions. So I think in lots of ways, this is a kind of touchstone example of the power of evidence and research in terms of shaping policy and our health and so on. But I also want to pause here and note that it wasn't a smooth transition process. The relationship between evidence, policy, and politics was a messy and complicated one, not least because we have large amounts of disinformation and other kind of forms of popularization of agendas and discontent and concerns about the vaccine and DNA and so on and so forth. And also, and this is more consequential for my purposes, we saw the effects of political interests. And the cartoon on the top left indicates how vaccine denial undermined evidence. The cartoon in the top right, which I took from the New York Times database of COVID vaccinations, points to the fact that here, as in many other cases, we see patterns of poverty and plenty and the effects of resource distributions, and most crucially, the fact that major pharmaceutical companies weren't prepared to share patents on vaccines. And as a consequence, we see a rollout of vaccines that is tied to entrenched dominant interests across the globe. And as a consequence of that, you can see one of these continents doesn't look like the others in terms of the effects of COVID vaccinations and the extent to which people in different parts of the world are protected from this disease. And this is my point of departure for thinking about evidence associated with research and policy and practice dealing with questions of human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor. So I want to suggest, and I don't mean under any circumstances to diminish or deny the importance of research, but I also want to suggest that there's an assumption that good research will organically and naturally trickle down into policy processes. And in this presentation, I want to kind of outline and excavate and interrogate why that transition isn't quite so smooth as we might otherwise hope. So why do we need more evidence? 20 years ago, there was this reinvention and reconfiguration where processes that had previously described and labeled under different designations, migration, child labor, came to be redefined and reconfigured under these ideas of first human trafficking and then more recently modern slavery. And as part of this process of reconfiguration, you see a large amount of sensationalist and superficial analyses going out. I'm sure we've all seen this help me kind of imagery, which is tied to the fact that this photo is free of copyright and can be shared all over the place. Very sensationalist claims regarding kind of estimates of scale and severity. And then just more disturbingly, certain pathologies associated with this issue. And the most strong recent evidence we have of these pathologies is the connection between QAnon and anti-trafficking. And here we see the extreme idea that the human child satanic sacrifice is a form of human trafficking involved to keep democratic politicians alive longer than they otherwise would. And I don't want to dive into this, but I do want to suggest that for a good 20-year period, that there was a limited evidence base around conversations associated with human trafficking and modern slavery. And I think that evidence base over time has been substantially improved. And there's now detailed research in cases and contexts and industries and sectors in a way that it wasn't available 20 years ago. So I think that the research that's taken place in recent times has placed us in a position that wasn't the case a couple of decades ago. And I think that's all to the good. I would also note here, however, but there's always been a temptation or hazard associated with research in this field where the moral urgency associated with the issues at stake has often meant that people are occasionally inclined to cut corners and to structure their research around the demands of advocacy and intervention, and as a consequence, undercut what Jacobson and Landau describe as the dual mandate. The dual mandate here being, if we want to be effective in relation to policy and intervention, we ultimately need to have a credible ethical and methodological foundation around which the research we use to insert and engage in policy practices. So I just recently finished a book on this, looking at forms of research on sexual violence in post-conflict situations. And I just briefly note that there are issues associated with how data is collected. And we see this in the African continent in particular. We have people parachuting into so-called exotic locations. They have a wheel and spokes model where people are commissioned as consultants, and consequently you end up with research which in many ways ends up being another extractive industry. So there's issues there. I'm not going to dive into them, but I just think they're worth noting in passing. My provocation, and I want to say here that it is a provocation, because given the time available, I don't necessarily have all the scope to show my working out. My provocation here is that there is already enough evidence. And I want to be careful here. There's already enough evidence on some things. And I'm interested here in thinking about what a call for more evidence does politically. We always need more evidence. There's no question that additional research would be extremely valuable in any number of given areas, and we should be doing the kinds of research we've been doing, and we need more of it. So this isn't a call to end research. It's a concern that the call for research means that we wait and delay until we know more. And on some cases and contexts at least, I want to suggest that the research base that is now available due to all the good work that's taken place in the last 2 decades means that there's certain things that we know with a reasonably high degree of confidence, and as a consequence should be incorporating these kinds of existing findings into policy, politics, advocacy, and intervention. So I'm going to give you 4 provocations. As I say, I'm not going to do all of the working out as we go. But I want to at least suggest that there's some things we know relatively well, and that the things we know relatively well are highly consequential when it comes to the potential for policy interventions. So the first provocation, and this I'd imagine is relatively uncontentious, is that tied visas for migrant workers, where workers are unable to change employers, and they're working in foreign countries under threat of deportation, are a recipe for vulnerability. It's not a function of individual employers exercising criminal instincts. It's built into the system as it stands. So tied visas where people are in a situation of constructed vulnerability, are a recipe for exploitation and abuse. And we know this through extensive research in any number of contexts and cases. And this, while relatively banal for people who've worked in the field of migration and labor, is nonetheless extremely consequential, because when it comes to policy interventions, the existence of tied visas is embedded within a set of economic and political interests, which mean that they are extremely resistant to changing the terms under which people migrate to work. Second provocation, corporate social responsibility doesn't work. And here I want to suggest that there's a couple of things that need to be emphasized. Firstly, the foundational premise that corporations work best when they regulate themselves is counterintuitive, given what we know about how corporations compete in a contemporary political economy. So it's not a very intuitive idea that corporations governing themselves, regulating themselves with no external oversight, provide the best foundation for dealing with patterns of labor exploitation and workplace abuse. And we know this because we have the Haken-Engel Protocol, which was designed as an initial implementation point to reduce the prevalence of forced and child labor in West Africa around cocoa production. Comes in 2001. Deadlines are extended, definitions are relaxed. The final report by Tulane 10 years later suggests that there's not been measurable progress, yet the underlying principles of corporate social responsibility nonetheless resurface in the UK government's Modern Slavery Act, which mandates that companies of a certain size have to give reports on their issues, on their practices to prevent modern slavery and human trafficking. These reports are non-binding, a bunch of people don't file them, and there's so much white noise associated with the sheer volume of different corporations that these statements are effectively useless. Yet this again becomes the basis for the Australian Modern Slavery Act. It becomes the basis for legislation contemplated in Canada. And as a consequence of this, a great deal of policy discussion has been organized around the assumption that Good Samaritan corporations on their own initiative, acting independently with no oversight from public regulation, provide an adequate basis to intervene to prevent patterns of forced and precarious labor in their supply chains and as part of their economic operations. Thirdly, the Nordic model doesn't work. Now, I understand that there's a tendency to create a silo around sex work, where sex work gets put in another box, and as a consequence of being put in another box, it is understood to stand apart from the conversations that people want to have when it comes to migration and work and child labor and so on. But I want to suggest here that this box and silo surrounding sex work is unhelpful politically and in other ways. And the main reason that sex work gets put in another box is because there's a resistance to the idea that, like all other forms of labor, it needs to be regulated rather than abolished. And the principal vehicle for this argument is the so-called Nordic model, which seeks to ensure that people who buy sex are criminalized and punished, and people who sell sex are removed from criminal sanction. But this is a mess. People still need to sell sex. It's still subject to a market. And as a consequence of setting up a partial criminal regime, you end up in a situation where people who sell sex have to create greater risks and so on and so forth. It's also worth noting here that the idea that there are valid paths associated with government intervention to ensure that women and men and others who sell sex can leave the commercial sex industry is something which is proved to be in lots of ways beyond the capacity of governments to effectively implement. So I want to suggest here that while there's always room for more evidence around this issue and other issues I've raised, there's enough evidence already out there to suggest that we should be structuring and organizing practices and interventions in support of these broad conclusions. And I also want to suggest here that this tendency to duck sex work as an issue, to not take a stand on sex work and to pretend that you can somehow remain neutral on this issue, in lots of ways is politically harmful. And then finally, criminal justice reform devours political bandwidth. So we saw this in relation to the Palermo human trafficking protocol. There was a great deal of not so deep reflection around the 20-year anniversary of Palermo. And Palermo was mislabeled as a human rights treaty. It's not a human rights treaty, it's an organized crime treaty. And it's not only an organized crime treaty, it is symptomatic of a broader understanding of human trafficking, which treats the problems of labor exploitation and vulnerability and abuse as requiring criminal intervention by agents of the state associated with the police and immigration and so on. And as a consequence of that, the vast majority of energy and investment around this issue continues to cycle around the idea that increasing criminal sanctions, having greater task teams, passing more criminal laws, and the like is the solution to the problems associated with forced labor and precarious labor and the like. Now, I'm not going to suggest here that there's not some gains that can't be made through a more judicious criminal justice approach. I think the problem is that there's always a temptation to come back to criminal justice as the focal point and hinge for policy interventions. And as a consequence, there's always a temptation to say, we'll get criminal justice reform right, and we'll deal with those other things on the agenda later. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where all the energy and investment associated with intervention gets cycled back into criminal justice reform, more police, more sanctions, more laws, and so on and so forth. So these are my provocations. As I say, I am going through this quicker than I might otherwise like. But I want to suggest that at least on some issues, we know quite a lot already, and we should be engaging with policy and practice on that basis. Now, I also want to suggest, and here I want to bring the political dynamics back in, that part of the challenge we face is that when you understand issues associated with human trafficking and forced labor as deviant criminal activities perpetrated by nefarious individuals, you end up with a diagnostic framework which misses the fact that patterns of vulnerability and exploitation and violence aren't deviant exceptions. They are in fact processes that arise out of the smooth and regular operations of the global economy. So they're intended consequences of how systems are set up. And as a consequence of this, I want to suggest that any discussion of interventions, policies, practices, campaigns has to grapple with the underlying structural dynamics which create the conditions which manufacture vulnerability and exploitation. So there's two key themes I want to emphasize. The first are the effects of political economy and labor markets. We have the race to the bottom, we have subcontracting, outsourcing, offshoring, the idea that people are independent contractors rather than working for a company. We have financial incentives to look the other way as a consequence of the fact that depressing wages and working conditions is an attractive business strategy to increase your bottom line. We have wage theft as a business model where paying people less for hours worked and forcing them to work longer is crucial to the ways in which production systems are organized. We have regulatory loopholes in relation to certain sectors of work, such as domestic work, and also regulatory loopholes associated with different jurisdictions and relating to the global production networks and supply chains. And then finally, we have gender divisions of labor, where certain forms of care and other forms of labor are tied to larger systems that leave women and girls in relatively dispossessed and marginal positions relative to men and boys. So this, to my mind at least, is the central axis around which we need to understand and conceptualize and hopefully address issues associating with forced and precarious labor. In addition to that, we also have further issues associated with migration and vulnerability. We have the tied visas, we have recruitment fees and debts, we have restrictions and settlement and citizenship. And crucially, we have the fact that migrant workers are set up and positioned in a way that they can't effectively collectively organize, they can't effectively mobilize. And this is by design. It's not an accident. This is the value of migrant workers relative to domestic workers, wherein you can depress wages and conditions for migrant workers in ways you can't for domestic workers. And as a consequence, this is why they are increasingly prevalent in various parts of the world. So I want to suggest here that it nearly all comes back to political economy. It's a combination of poverty, discrimination, migration regimes, outsources, labor protections, corporate power, sourcing practices, and the alliances between government and corporate interests. When I say nearly all comes back to political economy, there's two caveats here. The first caveat is there's a danger with this level of reductive essentialism, right? Like at a global level, there's a huge number of contextual and intermediate factors that are crucial to understanding local circumstances and situations. So it's a mistake to assume that the political economy factors running the global economy have the same effects in the same ways in multiple contexts. That's clearly not the case. And secondly, I would note here that I'm interested primarily in the intersection between migration and labor. I'm not, for example, dealing with forms of wartime abduction and violence and post-conflict settings and their outcomes. And there's other things that don't necessarily fit comfortably in this box. So I'm interested primarily here in forms of constructed vulnerability associated with migration and forms of constructed vulnerability associated with work. And in this context, we need to understand how economic systems are organized. We need to understand the interests that shape them. And we need to understand that the forms of exploitation that arise out of these systems are intended and not deviant. So my argument here, if we accept this broad diagnosis of the underlying structural conditions, is that the connection between evidence, policy, and politics is complicated by the way in which different governments and institutions and corporations who have skin in the game in terms of how the global economy is organized bend conversations about policy solutions in ways that deflect and dilute their potential capacity to change how systems are organized. So I want to suggest here that broadly, for the sake of argument, there are two major paths associated with combating human trafficking and forced labor. So the first path is trying to identify, isolate, and assist a small number of cases regarded as exceptional, the cases that rise to the threshold associated with human trafficking. And here slavery is doing a lot of work, because we all know slavery is the absolute worst of the worst. And as a consequence of elevating something alongside the category of slavery, we're really suggesting in lots of ways that it is an exceptional event. It is not regular in any way, shape, or form. Now, this process of trying to identify and isolate exceptional cases is really, really difficult. We all know that cases of forced labor, child labor, don't operate across an identifiable population who all share the same experiences and conditions. It's more likely instead that they arise out of the bottom end of the spectrum or continuum of exploitation. And people, as we know, move in and out of different conditions. And as a consequence of this, it's extremely difficult logistically to identify and target individual cases of forced and forced in the worst forms of child labor. So that's one path. The second path for trying to address these issues is trying to improve rights and protections for all workers and migrants. So here, I'm suggesting that we can think about ways of treating both exceptional and everyday cases of labor exploitation as symptoms of labor markets and migration regimes. And I want to suggest here that the second of these two options hold out much greater prospects of success in addressing all kinds of abuses, but they're also politically unpalatable. So they would require reforms to labor systems and migration regimes that people in positions of entrenched power are not keen on because they present threats to their economic and political interest. So here, when politics bends policy, I want to suggest that high levels of political and institutional support for ending human trafficking remains contingent upon the embrace of ineffective and self-serving policy solutions. Put more bluntly, and this is very blunt, politics bends policy towards solutions which don't really work or which serve other agendas. And here the most notable one is the conflation of anti-trafficking with anti-migration, and the idea that you can prevent human trafficking by building a giant wall across the border of the US and Mexico or other similar things. So that's where I land. What do we do about it? Now, this is a non-exhaustive list, but I think that the first point is we need to recognize that not everyone is on the same side here. And the rhetoric of everyone is united in shared opposition to slavery and human trafficking creates a situation where you have very high levels of support for a coup, yet support tends to be channeled into solutions which everyone can agree upon. And if everyone can agree upon it, it's not going to be effective. It's going to be a lowest common denominator solution. So I would like to repoliticize conversations around migration and labor. And here I want to suggest that there's a strand of interventions around these issues which are heavily technocratic. And technocracy here is the idea that you can stand apart from or above politics. You can engage in technology without engaging with politics. You can spot slavery in space without necessarily dealing with the fact that people already know where things are and it's built into systems. You can have apps which don't do anything but which look good to funders. So any solution which everyone can agree upon will not be effective. The second point I want to make is that there needs to be a real conversation about what happens when things don't work. So there's real reluctance to admit when interventions and policies don't work. Things get memory holed very quickly. And as a consequence, as a field, there's very little conversation about, well, this didn't work, and as a consequence, it's a need to recalibrate. The Haken-Engel protocol is an absolutely perfect example of this. We know it didn't work. There's evidence to prove it didn't work, but because no one remembers that it exists, its principles come back into the founding organization of the Modern Slavery Act and the corporate transparency requirements, which once again don't work. So as a consequence of this, if we can't talk about when things don't work and have a discussion of why and how they don't work, we can't have a meaningful conversation about how to recalibrate interventions. We have to speak up when other agendas are driving policy. We have to push back against the idea that border protection is a recipe for preventing human trafficking, because it's effectively a recipe for greater death when people try and move. We have to decenter criminal justice. We can't give in to the temptation to do yet one more round of criminal justice reform in the hope that it'll finally get it right. I don't mean to dismiss criminal justice, but we're expecting too much of criminal justice. We're expecting police and immigration agents to be social workers, and we're expecting that interventions focused on carceral solutions are going to be adequate for dealing with complex social problems. We have to detach immigration enforcement from labor rights. We need public labor inspectors that aren't immigration agents. We need to understand that when forced labor occurs, it tends to be nested in a host of other labor abuses, which means that we need to be thinking about wage theft and worker health and safety. We need to prioritize unions, organized labor, and the struggle for decent work, because corporations do not improve wages and working conditions out of the good of their hearts. We need binding transnational regulation of corporate supply chains, because self-regulation is not going to work. It is deflecting and displacing a policy conversation about business models. And finally, we need to change funding streams to support core funding for migrant and labor rights organizations. So the shift to consultancies where people are given short-term commissions in order to implement someone else's vision creates a situation where people who work on these issues are constantly scrambling for the next contract. It means that they don't have the independent capacity to work with their own communities in order to build up interventions on their own terms. They instead end up in a situation where people chase dollars in order to survive, in a context where funders from the global north dictate language and priorities and intervention points. And as a consequence, we have the global south speaking back to the global north in languages and priorities that the global north dictates. And as a consequence, we end up in a situation where people don't have the organizational capacity to learn and build. So funding streams need to go to organizations in untied ways over multiple years so they can build up their own capacity rather than speak back the priorities of their funders. So all of this boils down to an argument that we have to shift from a model which prioritizes exceptional cases to focusing on everyday systems. And here, and I'm sure you've seen this triangle or a version thereof it previously, we have to recognize that this conversation about slavery and forced labor is at the absolute pinnacle of a triangle. It's a small number of cases at the absolute top, and the vast majority of people don't rise to this threshold of exceptionality. At the same time, we have to be aware of triangles. And here I want to suggest that if we take the ILO figures, and they're not super reliable, but they're the benchmark figures, that there's 24.5 million victims of forced labor. This is a very small fraction of a global workforce where informal labor is somewhere in the region of 2 billion people. So when we look at the triangle, there's a danger of assuming that work and labor regimes arise out of standards set in the global north in the post-war era, where there's unions, where there's labor protections, where there's minimum wages, and so on. So here we have to recognize that free labor, as it is understood, is in a highly privileged condition, and that the vast majority of the world's workers and the vast majority of the world's migrants who work are subject to various forms of informality, precarity, vulnerability, and so on. And as a consequence of that, it's worth recognizing that the assumptions people make about work and movement are not necessarily accurate or useful. And if we want to target interventions, it's that big bit in the middle that is ultimately the main focal point that should be in relation to how we're thinking about how evidence leads to policy and how to grapple with and engage with the effects of political interests. So that's my pitch. Broader versions of the same types of argument can be found in this website and in some of the recent publications that myself and colleagues have put together. So I hope that was useful.
I would like to clap my hands and thank you so much, Joel, for this provocative and also very interesting presentation. We have some comments from the chat. And if anyone would like to raise your comments or ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you to ask a question. And before that, perhaps I can start to read out some of the comments. First of all, excellent structured presentation about evidence, policy, and politics. Also on reality and data. Professor Joel Quirk, I appreciate your elucidation and the foundation of your study. So very good comments. We have a question from Prachi. Go ahead.
Hi, Professor Joel. I am almost a fan. I had attended your entire course on edX, and it's very nice to be interacting with you here. So I've used the framework of political economy to study unfree labor in Indian agriculture. And what I found was that because the form of this unfree labor takes, it's very difficult to organize these workers. They're kind of competing against each other for limited jobs. And also, so for example, if you want to organize sex workers, there's a diversity of the kind of work that they're doing. For example, begging, and then, engaging in sex, and there's a ladder. And one worker may think that they're better than the other person and they don't want to be organized in one group. How do we deal with that problem? I mean, it's just I'm just trying to ask, how do we organize workers when there is those kind of antagonistic class relations that exist amongst them? Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, are you going to batch or should I just answer as we go?
Feel free to answer as we go.
Okay, so there's definitely an issue where there's the risk of fetishizing organized labor as a solution. And the problem we have with fetishizing organized labor as a solution is it tends to be strongest in the places where it's needed least and weakest in the places it's needed most. And part of the issue here, I think at least, is the idea of an employer and a worker is often a very poor description of the types of work that people do. They end up being, in for want of a better word, self-employed. So waste pickers, for example, don't really work for anyone in the sense that they're picking up waste and they're using it to generate an income. But at the same time, I mean, you can still organize waste pickers. I mean, there's a really good example of this in Colombia where there's associations measured in the tens of thousands, and you can really see a really good, like, significant political footprint. But I do also think, like, the idea that you come from the outside and organize in lots of ways is kind of part of this kind of developmental intervention logic, which isn't necessarily the best starting point. So I think in lots of ways we should be thinking more in terms of forms of participant action research, where instead of coming with an agenda, we kind of generate our agendas out of conversations with the peoples most affected by potential interventions. And so as a consequence of that, I think when it comes to work, there's forms of organization that are available, but we have to recognize that the pressures are very hard, and people, due to the effects of economic competition, understand themselves as in competition with other workers. So here, understanding the problem of precarity solely as a labor market frame misses the broader weaknesses in the social safety net in terms of thinking about things like basic income or provision of public services and so on and so forth. So I think at that point it gets even bigger as a challenge, but it's that kind of point of intervention that I think is most useful. So workers shouldn't be organized by outsiders. Workers in lots of ways should be organizing themselves, and the support should come in terms of facilitating rather than leading, ideally. Though I appreciate that's incredibly easy to say and much, much harder to realize in practice.
All right, so I will move on. Simon has a comment, so feel free to ask the questions or make a comment, and I will call on a few more, so we will take them in a batch. Simon.
Hi, Joel. Thanks very much, Lorraine. Joel, that was a fantastic presentation, and I'm not sure I could put a cigarette paper between your views and mine. Much of what you said reflects what I published in the RTE ESPOL Journal article in February, which looked at one aspect that you touched on, and I'd like to raise because I think it's worth further consideration, and that's how a wave of ethno-nationalist populist governments have sought to, first of all, conflate forced labour with trafficking. And I have to say it was the British in this case that invented the category of modern slavery, although it appears nowhere in any international convention. Theresa May, the author of The Hostile Environment that led to the Windrush scandal, was also the author of the UK Modern Slavery Act. And I have real problems with the terminology that has grown from it, not least the conflation of exploitation with forced labour, as though exploitation doesn't take place anywhere else other than in conditions of forced labour. One of the things that worries me very much about much of the developmental journalism that I read now is that exploitation is used as a synonym for forced labour. Well, if nobody else was exploited, we wouldn't need trade unions and collective bargaining. And I think your point about the rest of the economy, a political economy, a precarious economy, is absolutely well made. I think the point you make about self-organisation is absolutely crucial. And I think actually it's fair to say that a number of formal trade union movements have adopted exactly that strategy, that you don't go out to unorganised workers with a megaphone, you go out with a hearing aid and you listen to their needs and you support their self-organisation. But I think one of the challenges we face particularly in the child labour area, which is my main area of expertise, and I was in Durban, that's the 5th I've been at every child labour conference since Oslo, was the absence of small farmers, small producers organisations. And you talked about the failure of the Harkin-Engel protocol. You talked about the challenges of of policy on sex work. Both of those policy areas tend to be debated in the absence of the people whose rights are being discussed. So sex workers' unions aren't included in discussions about the protection of sex workers' rights, and small farmer organisations were not present in adequate numbers in Durban, although most child labour happens on family farms. So this point about hybrid organisation and understanding that all types of workers need organisations to defend themselves collectively, I think is absolutely crucial. And my two pleas for further research are, one, let's have more of a compendium on good practice or promising practice of supporting innovative means of self-organisation. I worked with small fishers, artisanal fishers on Lake Volta for several years. I've done some work with sex workers in Europe when I was working with the British Trade Union Congress. I've done ILO project work with, for example, rubbish pickers in Pakistan and so on and so forth. So there's lots of evidence that we can collate and try and derive some common strands of what works. That's the first area. And the other area of research which seems to me to be missing, and I really would like, because I think it's very political and I'd like to hear your views on this. We had between 2008 and 2012 an extraordinary acceleration in progress against child labour. Child labour fell during those years by 47 million. In the subsequent years, it fell by only 7 million, then a little bit more, and in recent years it's increased by 8 million. All of it 5 to 11-year-olds in sub-Saharan Africa, overwhelmingly in family agriculture. So apart from commenting on those trends, my question to you is, why do you think there is an almost total absence of research into what made those 4 years so successful in order to learn the lessons from that success? I have my own ideas, but I'd be really interested to hear your view. This seems to be the most important research question of all for child labour. You have 4 years of brilliant success and nobody takes it apart and says, what were the key lessons to be learnt from those 4 years, particularly in Brazil and India, under Lula and under the UPA government in India. So anyway, I've said more than enough, but I think the presentation is absolutely bang on, and we clearly are very, very much aligned in our views on almost everything you said. Thank you very, very much. Great to hear you.
Thank you so much, Simon. And we'll take one more question from Thea, and then I'll let you, Joel, to address all of them.
Thank you so much, Professor Quirk. I've been a long-time reader of your writing on the open democracy, actually, and I think it contributed to my pessimistic point of view on my work, working on human trafficking or researching or, advocacy. Myself, I've seen, like, for example, since the Palermo Protocol, the debate on, sex work or labor and so on, like say sex trafficking and trafficking, labor trafficking and so on has been so divided, and I see a lot of movement conflating sex work and trafficking and all of these, and I've witnessed how resources that should have been channeled towards, supporting workers' movement or empowering them, rather channeled towards awareness raising and flyers. Take into account the current conflict of the Russian invasion. In Ukraine, lots of organizations been focusing on producing fragmented, incoherent flyers, raising awareness about human trafficking, and they actually not thinking about how the refugees, they have liquidity needs, they cannot convert the Ukrainian currency into the local currency, like totally missing the mark, everything. So working on this field, human trafficking research and advocacy, I've been always having the challenge that, or the question is my work really necessary? Is it channeling the resources outside, like on working, like focusing on human trafficking rather than actually something providing direct support or direct sort of training and empowering the vulnerable groups in a way? So I'm just wondering for your opinions and thoughts on this, maybe in hopes that you could sort of lift my mood or my pessimistic views on this, partly caused by also the work that I've read from, your great work and all this stuff, and also the ironies in the anti-human trafficking community itself. I don't know if I made myself clear, but yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for the presentation.
Joel, so there are also 2 more questions in the chat. So I'll just read them out and let's see if you will be able to address them. Because if not, I'm pretty sure people can contact you and they can follow up on the questions. So there's one question from Fernanda Chima. She mentioned that regarding fitting into the language and system of global north from south is so true. What would be some of the approaches to strengthen Southern companies and labor from within? And another question in the chat is from Fernanda Mora. Thanks for this great presentation. Any examples on successful efforts for binding transnational regulations on supply chains? Over to you, Joel.
They're all the easy ones, right? I'm going to preface this by saying I don't think I can do justice to those questions because there's a level of complexity. So if it's okay, I'll maybe just pick up and kind of say what I can try and say, and I would obviously welcome any follow-up conversations. If my email address isn't somewhere, can it please be made somewhere? Because I really would appreciate a longer opportunity. In terms of thinking through issues, I just want to note the modern slavery thing is Caroline Robinson and I did this thing on the Anti-Trafficking Review on the global economy and labor exploitation, and as part of this I kept writing about modern slavery, and she kept telling me the vast majority of the world doesn't talk about modern slavery. It's the British, it's whoever Andrew Forrest is funding at any given moment, and that's basically it. Like the rest of the world is very much concerned about human trafficking and maybe a little bit of forced labor, depending on where you land in various international forums. And I think that's correct. I think there is a fixation on this term modern slavery, not least because it's much easier to critique in lots of ways. So I think in the past I've been guilty of that, and I think that's worth bringing out. In terms of while the child labor goes down, I'm going to pass just because I'm not an expert on child labor, and I haven't looked in enough detail. My suspicion is that you tend to see aggregate gains arising out of specific interventions in individual countries with large populations. So we know that the UNDP kind of gains in terms of people being lifted out of poverty primarily arise out of increases in social welfare in relation to China and India, and because China and India have such huge populations in aggregate terms, they end up increasing the global scale in general. So my suspicion is that PT in Brazil, as a consequence of government intervention, did quite a lot of good work there, but I'm speculating grossly at this point. In terms of where this lands, I think there's a bunch of stuff that the field just shouldn't be doing. Raising awareness campaigns are nearly entirely useless unless they're very specifically targeted. Telling people about the dangers of movement is completely useless. People who are about to move already know it's dangerous. Telling them about this is just dumb. And so there are certain things I think if we had a conversation about what worked and didn't work, we could potentially be doing more of stuff that has a shot and less of stuff which is pointless and self-serving. I mean, we shouldn't be training all police officers in national jurisdictions to look out for trafficking. It's a huge suck of time and energy, and it has very limited results. So I think if we stack policy responses alongside each other and go, given what we know now, which of these should we stop doing? And here I think the idea of stopping doing something is an extremely hard issue to confront. Once something is set in motion, you end up with heavy investment in continuing it moving. So we have huge numbers of national hotlines, for example, around human trafficking. Others like them. And once you have one, there's an idea that you should always have one. And as a consequence, you end up in this path-dependent relationship. And I think some interventions have to end. We have to stop doing them. And that's a hard conversation to have. And when they end, they become these martyrs to the cause, where they would have been very successful, but for the fact the funding was pulled. So I think that becomes a difficult thing. In terms of where the interventions work, I think, and for the purposes of time, I was a bit fast in terms of setting up the problem. There's a whole bunch of stuff around direct support for people who've experienced severe exploitation, which I didn't really get into, and not by getting into it, I don't really want to dismiss or diminish. I think there's a great deal of value in frontline service provision in order to help people whose lives have been subject to extreme trauma get back on their feet in various ways. And that's not something that my presentation grappled with, but I do think, even if it doesn't necessarily change the systems on which the world runs, it's nonetheless extremely valuable as intervention points. So I do actually think that frontline service provision is extremely valuable in the sense of immediately helping people in distress. And I think in lots of ways, that would be one of the areas where investment can be more usefully channeled. I would also note here that, like, it may be a slightly pessimistic conversation, but if you go and talk to people who are full-time on migrant rights, it begins to get a lot worse. So the migrant rights conversation in lots of ways is, you know, you have a look here in South Africa, there's xenophobic violence against the most vulnerable. If you go and have a look at you know, private militia camps in Libya funded by the EU, it gets even worse. And then you have populist reactionary xenophobia and building walls and barriers and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to concede right now that the world's just not in good shape. And the people who are hell-bent on making it smaller and less connected and crueler are in the ascendancy in lots of ways right now. So I'm not sure that helped with the pessimism, but I do think, and it's worth emphasizing, that we have a lot of history to support the idea that when we organize together, that there are things that can be done that make positive and profound transformations in people's lives. And at some point, I'd like to do a bit of work on how those previous battles were won, because it strikes me that workers organized have done remarkable things, that women organized have done remarkable things, that slaves and freed slaves organized have done remarkable things. And there's lots of examples we can point to where things perhaps were even bleaker, yet there's nonetheless positive transformations that can and have been made. So I don't want to end up in a pessimistic place, but I can understand why people land there, because the world right now is just not so great. I don't know how that helps. I don't even know if it helps at all, in all fairness. In terms of positive examples I'd point to, I think there's four I'd mention. I think that the Brazilian forced labor campaigns arising out of PT and Lula were flawed, like all things are flawed, but were nonetheless extremely consequential. So I think that blacklists of companies, I think appropriating profits, I think that in engaging in public intervention and inspection and remedy, it can and should be extremely powerful. So we know the state is flawed, we know the state has problems, but if we're invested in this idea of the public good and public interventions, we're still going to have to try and be in a situation where we encourage states to intervene and do more. And I think that the Brazilian model, focusing on what they call slavery in the early 2000s, was a model we could point to and build upon. Of course, it's been memory hold and doesn't really draw up the same kind of profile as whatever the UK did. I also think that there's examples of organization like the Asia Floor Wage, which I think was extremely successful in creating minimum standards. I think that the Fire and Safety Accord in Bangladesh was limited but still consequential. I think that the Immokalee workers and the Fair Food campaign has been remarkably successful. And I know that people that are experts on these things and others will pull out and point to their limitations and problems and all the rest of it. And I think that's reasonable. They're obviously not perfect. But I do think we're too tempted to say that if we change the name of something, if we find some new form of language, or we just recalibrate how we talk about things, a new and different landscape will open up to us. And political change is not easy, and it never will be easy. So we have to kind of resist that. I think the threshold, to my mind, is whether or not something is being successful, is whether or not key figures within government and the corporate world want these reforms to be reversed. So if you introduce a policy, a campaign, and everyone is happy with it, and all the stakeholders think this thing is fine, it's dandy, we like it a lot, it's almost certainly pointless. And the reason for that is that if you want to bend how systems operate, you have to challenge someone's interests. And if you challenge someone's interests, they should and will be upset about how you've cut into their bottom line. So a successful intervention is an intervention that certain stakeholders within society want to walk back. And you can see this in Brazil, where one of the things Bolsonaro did, amongst all the many horrible things Bolsonaro did, was to try and dilute and cut down on the labor laws introduced under the PT regime. So I think that, to my mind, is a measure for success. A measure for success is some people are upset about a policy reform. If you introduce a policy reform and no one's upset about it, it's almost certainly a sign that it didn't bend the curve in terms of changing migration and economic systems.